show muscles, fake muscles, are they actually a thing? This term show muscle has been thrown around for a long time, and there are some wildly differing opinions on what this means, whether show muscles are actually a thing, whether this whole idea of bodybuilding style training, building quote unquote fake muscles that only look good but don't really perform, at least not as they should. Is this whole idea a myth, or is there some truth to it? Or is it maybe entirely true? That's what I want to talk about in this video, because I recently remembered that I've sort of addressed this on the side in previous videos, but I've never actually talked about the topic full on. So let's dive into it. The idea behind show muscle is essentially that bodybuilders work out specifically to grow their muscles. So they are not training towards any sort of end goal. They are not training to generate a lot of power, dynamically. They are not training to statically lift a lot of weight. They're not training to hold a lot of weight for a long time. So for strength endurance, they're essentially trying to optimize their training as much as possible for the muscle to get as big as possible. So there's essentially no function to what they are doing. And I think this has created the idea in people's heads that, well, if a weightlifter trains a specific way to become very strong, say, or some type of athlete, in some sport, let's say American football, trains a certain way to use his muscles with a lot of dynamic force. If someone in a sport like that trains his muscles to have a lot of explosive, dynamic power and speed, there's a reason why they train differently to bodybuilders, right? So there must be some sort of discrepancy in capability between these athletes and someone who only trains to have big aesthetic muscles. Although I would argue that most bodybuilders are not actually that aesthetic, depending on what category they are competing in, of course. But these steroids orcs are definitely not what I would call aesthetic, and most people, I think, would call aesthetic. That aspect aside, though, the idea here is essentially that you build certain types of muscle based on the training you do. So you build explosive, athletic muscle, and maybe even specific types of athletic muscle, depending on the sport you do, if you train in such a way, and you build these sort of fluff, fake muscles when you train like a bodybuilder. Let's address this first, because this is essentially, in a major way, the myth part of the whole show muscle, fake muscle idea. Muscle fiber is muscle fiber. There are some things beyond having additional muscle fibers that will make your muscles look bigger, like holding water, for example, right? So there are some aspects that I'm sure professional bodybuilders also use for their shows to look fuller, look even bigger. But muscle fiber is muscle fiber. If the muscle is there, it can move shit. It raises the potential strength of the individual because it's just additional contractile tissue, which means the baseline muscle that moves stuff, let's say the bicep for bending the arm, is just technically stronger. There are different types of muscle fibers. There are fast twitch and slow twitch muscle fibers. And depending on how you train, your muscle can have a slightly different composition. But if you try to get your muscles as big as possible, ideally you would train for fast twitch and slow twitch muscle fibers to an extent to grow both of them and get a sizable muscle. So, yes, someone can be smaller than a bodybuilder and still have a lot of, let's say, explosive strength if they have a high fast twitch muscle composition. But that doesn't mean the bodybuilder is weak in this regard. And just the same, someone can have a lot of slow twitch muscle fibers, can have a lot of strength endurance, essentially, but so can a bodybuilder. And in fact, if you look at the kind of weight many professional bodybuilders were lifting, it's not insignificant weight. What they were bench pressing, what they were bent over rowing, deadlifting in some cases, but many bodybuilders don't really deadlift. Those were significant numbers. Now, granted, they didn't really go for 1 rep maxes, so the numbers they were moving might not seem as impressive to a weightlifter, let's say. But again, the goal is not to get a high 1 rep max, so there wouldn't really be a point to doing it, because 1 rep maxes are shit for growing muscle. But if you try to sort of translate the weight they are moving at 5, 6, 8, 10, 12 reps, you will realize that most sort of iconic bodybuilders were very, very strong. Now, some people, especially sort of diehard martial artists, diehard combat sport practitioners, and maybe sort of sports athletes from other fields, they might say, okay, bodybuilding at the end of the day is sort of a weightlifting style training. You're doing similar things to a Olympic weightlifter or a power lifter or someone like that. So it kind of makes sense that you would still be decently strong at lifting weights, even if you're not quite as good. But what you're doing doesn't translate to our sports. You need to train for the specific movements of the sport for that muscle to really be applicable. So it is still kind of show muscle in the sense that, yeah, maybe in a very isolated context, you can lift heavy weight or push a lot of weight on the bench, but you can't really apply that strength to like a roll or a sparring match. Like, you don't punch harder because you're a big dude. And this is also kind of false. Now, I say this as someone who does utilize a lot of bodybuilding style lifting, a lot of bodybuilding style workouts in his training regime. And what I can confidently tell you is that the muscle you build is absolutely 100% applicable to lots of different fields, lots of different sports. See, the thing still is, the muscle someone who trains for boxing or who trains for a grappling or wrestling sport or for something completely different, again, American football or rugby or something, the muscle these types of people build is exactly the same thing. It's still just muscle fiber. There is no sort of chemical difference in these muscles. There are some physiological differences, and I'll get into that in just a moment. But the muscle itself is just muscle. It's just muscle fibers. And the more muscle fibers you have, the stronger your muscle potentially is, the stronger the baseline potential for strength is. You can make a muscle stronger without putting on additional mass, without adding on fibers. But the sort of cap for that, the sort of upper limit of how strong you can make a muscle without building more muscle, right? Putting on additional muscle fibers, that is determined by how big the muscle is. Again, I'll talk about, other physiological aspects, how you can actually get stronger without putting on muscle in a moment here. But it's safe to say the upper limit is determined by your muscle mass. So more muscle fibers automatically mean that the strength potential is greater. And someone who consistently puts on muscle, consistently adds on muscle fibers to his bicep, to his chest, to his abs, his legs, what have you, will get stronger with those body parts. So to close the myth segment of this video, muscle is muscle. The idea that bodybuilders somehow have built a unique, specific type of muscle that is not actually applicable to this sport or that sport or sports in general is just not true. It is silly from a physiological perspective. It simply doesn't make sense. If you have more muscle fiber, you will be stronger and your potential for maximum strength will also be greater. However, there is some truth to the idea of show muscles, though I don't think referring to the muscle itself as fake, as show muscle, is necessarily the best way of talking about this. Because the muscle itself is not the issue. As we have established, muscle is muscle, contractile tissue is contractile tissue, and having bigger muscles simply makes those muscles stronger and greatly raises their upper strength potential. However, there are other factors that play into whether a muscle is performing as well as it could be in a specific athletic endeavor. If we look at short bursts of strength, so either straight up power, which I would say is not necessarily just strength, it's also agility, because power does have a lot to do with technique. You kind of explode into a punch, let's say. I talked about what I call the endurance power scale in a previous video, which is going to be somewhere up here, which is essentially the idea that strength lies somewhere in between endurance and power. On the one end of the spectrum, you have endurance, which is essentially just how long can you do something, how long can you hold out. And on the other end, you have power, which is sort of the max force you can exert in a moment. And strength is somewhat in between, because what most people would consider strength includes both some endurance, like holding heavy objects for a long time, and also some more explosive strength, like a heavy 1-rep max, for example. But if we look at actual athletic endeavors, again, throwing a punch, tackling someone, that type of thing, strength is not the only factor that plays into power. Agility plays a big role as well. And connected to agility, ideal technique. So performing the technique properly and having the agility to move into the technique with the perfect sort of timing and positioning to exert, using your strength, the most force you can exert, that is something bodybuilders will not have, because it is specific to sports. It is specific to actually being an athlete. And I actually think, depending on the sports we are talking about, that it's not even necessarily a 100% specific skill. I think many athletic capabilities are translatable to other sports. But this has nothing to do with the athletes actually having different muscles than a bodybuilder. It just has to do with the fact that these athletes, in general, train for explosiveness, train for the idea of power. Sort of intuitively, their body understands how to exert great amounts of force. If you've done, let's say, wrestling, right? A lot of what you can do is going to translate very, very well into something like American football, because you're used to exerting force in a way that allows you to very effectively take someone down. So your body intuitively is going to understand how it can apply that to the new sport much better than the body of someone who doesn't train this at all, right? Who doesn't train for power at all, for explosiveness, who just grows his muscles. Again, though, that doesn't have anything to do with the baseline muscles, with the actual muscle fiber. The muscles are the same. The question is, how can the body apply them, right? What muscle memory does it have inside those muscles? How are those muscles utilized? Now, if we look at strength endurance, that's something bodybuilders are probably going to be a little better at, but still going to be worse at than someone who trains for strength endurance. The problem that bodybuilders run into here is that, again, they usually do some cardio, but they don't do a lot of endurance training. So they don't have the greatest stamina just off the bat. They might have the actual muscle fiber to do what is required, but their body is not adapted to high-level cardio, to high-level endurance activities. And what this means is that their capillary beds, for example, which is essentially the tiniest blood vessels that are more or less the endpoints for transporting oxygen into the muscle, are not as dense as those of someone who does or has done a lot of endurance training. So what this means is that they might have the muscle they require for, let's say, a strongman activity that is more strength endurance based. Maybe they have the muscle, but the problem is that muscle over time will not get enough oxygen to perform as well as, let's say, a strongman with a similar amount of muscle on this strength endurance task. They might do well, whatever the specific task is. This, of course, kind of depends on the event. They might do quite well in the beginning, but their muscle is going to run out of oxygen much sooner because their system, again, their actual blood vessels are not set up to supply this much oxygen to their quite sizable muscles. So again, we have essentially a discrepancy here in, well, not necessarily skill, actual physiological capability, but it's again not down to the muscles. It's because of another factor, another aspect. Getting kind of hot. I had to drop the sweater real quick. So we got muscle memory and agility. We got endurance as limiting factors that might make the muscles of bodybuilders appear like show muscles, fake muscles, even though they aren't. But these are the true limiting factors behind the sort of mystery, behind the question. The third thing, and this applies to just basic heavy lifts, a heavy 1 rep max that is done with strict form, or let's say 2 reps or maybe 3 reps that are very, very heavy. The third factor that applies here is neural drive. Your nervous system is actually what determines how effectively you use the muscle that is there. And this is something I kind of got at earlier when I talked about the baseline potential being determined by your muscle mass. What I mean by this is that how strong you can maximally be is a question of how much muscle mass you have. And then, of course, how you are actually built in terms of your skeleton. Maybe you have narrow shoulders, maybe you have wide shoulders, short arms, long arms. All of that is going to play into leverages when it comes to things like bench press, deadlift, etc. And it's going to make some things easier and some things harder. But in terms of actual musculature, right, in terms of things you can actually train, you can actually change, muscle, just basic muscle mass, is the main determining factor in how strong you can maximally get. However, this doesn't mean that you're necessarily going to be that strong if you're not using that muscle effectively. And if you don't train to lift or move in some capacity as much weight as possible with the muscle you have, you are always going to use less than 100%, or let's say 95%, of the muscle available. The reason for this is that your body generally tries to protect both your muscles and, perhaps more importantly, your joints and ligaments. And using 100% of your muscular power, of what your contractile tissue is actually capable of, can be risky for the body. So most people only use a very limited amount of their muscle mass, or are generally only capable of exerting a very limited amount. And it takes training and getting used to essentially just pushing and pulling harder and harder to activate those additional percentages. So if I remember correctly, the average human only uses like 50, 60% of their actual contractile tissue, right, of the muscle fiber they have. So essentially, if you look at this arm, that would be like me cutting off the arm somewhere here. And that is essentially like this bit of the arm is all I'm using to move stuff. And the thing is, because most bodybuilders only train to grow the muscle, but they never go into super low rep ranges, right? They never actually try to test the absolute limit of what the muscle is capable of strength-wise, because again, very, very low reps are just bad for muscle growth. Because of this fact, many bodybuilders don't have the neural drive to lift as heavy as they potentially could with the muscle mass they have, which might make them seem weak in comparison to someone who is similarly heavy or is maybe lighter than them and is able to, let's say, bench more on a 1-rep max. But what you have to keep in mind, again, is that the main factor for this is not the muscles, right? So the muscles are not show muscles. They are not fake muscles. The muscle itself has nothing to do with this. It is how the nervous system of the person that is actually lifting the weight uses the muscles. So we have these three aspects: agility and muscle memory, endurance, and just your basic neural drive. How much of the muscle fiber, how many percent of the muscle fiber your nervous system is actually triggering to do a movement. And all of these have contributed to the idea that bodybuilding style training builds showy, fake muscles that can't actually do anything. Now you might be wondering, why am I making this video? Because this is interesting, right? Sure, it's cool to learn about, but how is this relevant to an athlete? Does it really matter whether the muscles are at fault or whether it's other aspects if the result is essentially the same, right? If I train like a bodybuilder, I'm going to be worse at actual athletic endeavors. And to that, I would say, yes, it makes a big difference. Want to know why? Because building muscle is more work in the sense that it takes a significantly longer time than all of the other aspects I just mentioned. Now, building really, really, really high quality muscle memory on a lot of different movements can take time. But technically, building muscle memory is something you can do very, very quickly. If you drill certain moves, let's say basic moves you need for this sport or that sport, if you drill them for a couple of months, a year, 2 years, you're going to be pretty decent at what you do. Same thing goes for agility. Agility is coordination. It's how you're using your muscles and joints and tendons, how you are moving your body. That's something that's closer to the sort of skill area. And it is, again, something that you can much more easily train. Endurance is the same. You can build very, very good endurance within a reasonable time frame. Again, I want to make this very clear. I'm not talking about like 2 weeks here. I'm talking about several months, half a year, 2 years. And this might sound like long time frames to you. Same thing goes for training your nervous system, by the way, which can be done in a, not unsubstantial, but relatively short period of time as well. These times might not sound short to you, but then you have to realize that to actually get your muscle mass to a high level, and as always, I am exclusively talking about natural lifters here because I'm not interested in steroid nonsense. To get your muscle mass to a high level, we're talking about something like 10 years. Okay, 10 years, 11 years. That's when we can talk about advanced lifting status, that type of thing. So even though a year, 2 years might sound like a long time to you, it is absolutely minuscule compared to the amount of time it takes to build a significant amount of muscle. And if you now imagine that for this same time, you have been doing some sort of strength / hypertrophy training, but have done so much less effectively, right? Because you've sort of combined hypertrophy style training with specialized training for your sport, or you're doing more of a strength and conditioning type of training, you probably won't have built quite as much over that same time. It'll still take a very long time to build significant amounts of muscle, and even then, you still won't build a ton because you're not actually specifically training to build muscle. And you might say, well, I would rather focus on getting good at my sport than building muscle. Sure. But the question is, are you a specialist or do you just want to be athletic? Because the whole idea of this channel, what I talk about, is getting into great physical shape in general. Not being super specialized for one sport, but being physically capable, being athletic, being an absolute beast, just all around, right? You can fight, you can climb, you can run, you can hike. You can do all of this stuff very, very well. Because let's face it, most people watching this are not professional athletes. You're not making your money being hyper specialized in a certain sport. And so by hyper specializing in a sport, you might be missing out on being even fitter than you are by specializing in that sport, and way more capable in many other avenues of life. All this is to say, bodybuilding style training, when combined with extensive endurance training, when combined with something like fighting or dancing that does train your agility, your reflexes, your muscle memory, and also just lifting really heavy shit every now and then, maybe every now and then going for a 1 rep max or something of the sort. Combining all of these things is what's going to make you as athletic as possible. It's not going to make you the best rugby player. It's not going to make you the best football player. But it's going to make you capable of very quickly, within probably like a couple of months, a year, becoming very good, at the very least decent in a sport like that, and right off the bat, at anything you pick up, anything you do, being significantly better than the average person. So you are going to be above average on essentially everything you do. You're not going to be the best, but you're also not going to be terrible at anything. All right, it's time for breakfast, so I'm going to leave it at that. I hope you guys enjoyed yourselves, learned something, found this video interesting, and were maybe inspired to train a little bit more generally, include some bodybuilding style training into your workout regime if you are a specialized athlete right now, because it will just all around make you more athletic. The more muscle mass you have, the greater your general strength potential, and that is going to apply to anything you do. If you did enjoy the video, if you were inspired or learned something, go ahead and leave a like. And yeah, feel free to drop a comment if you feel the need to say something, or if you just want to push the algorithm. If you're interested in getting some help on your fitness journey, you can always go ahead and hit me up on Instagram for either a personalized training program or some personal coaching. If you're interested in that, just go over there, drop me a DM. We'll talk about details. I'm also currently working on a video course that we'll be releasing soon. So for anyone who is too socially awkward to hit me up and actually interact with me in person, you can just go ahead and get a pretty decent amount of quality that you would be getting with me as a sort of personal one-on-one coach. From the course, there's going to be several workout programs, information on diet, etc. Everything you need to essentially build the type of physique I just talked about, a hybrid athletic physique that is strong, capable, essentially the body of a barbarian, a primal physique that's just good at everything. If you want to see more videos of mine on fitness, on training, on different aspects of the athletic field, I also make videos on general health and more philosophical topics. If you're interested in that type of thing, go ahead and subscribe, and as always, activate the notification bell so you get notifications. And yeah, I'll see you in the next video. Until then, have a good one.